Hello, my name is Brent Hunt, and today is actually the 31st day of December 2022, and my channel is Discerning What is True. And what I'm going to be doing is reading from Redemption 4.5, and we're going to get right to it right now. And we're going to start at the section called Cows and the Pasture of Freedom, the Hidden Choice. The way out of this dilemma can be very complex. It definitely is, folks. In fact, its complexity was intentional. Roosevelt had violated the law by placing all people into involuntary servitude without their true consent. Congressman named Lewis T. McFadden brought formal charges against the Federal Reserve, and the Secretary of Treasury was coming dangerously close to calling for the impeachment of Franklin D. Roosevelt. 2 months after the executive order of June 5, 1933, the Senate and House Representatives, 73rd Congress, first session at 4:30 p.m., approved House Joint Resolution 192. This is important. Joint resolution to suspend the gold standard and to abrogate the gold clause. Joint resolution to assure uniform value to the coins and currency of the United States. This is the act which formally declared the bankruptcy of the United States in all caps. FDR, by executive order, as the commander-in-chief of the military social construct, declared all people outside the military federalized territories to be the enemy by illegally altering the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1861 and revised in 1918. The creation of the federal zone citizenship, you need to understand this. This is the reason why they're warring against you. You're seen as being a traitor. You see, it started out under President Lincoln. It was revised under Wilson, and now it's being changed again. That is in 1933. Okay, so you're seen as an enemy of the state. Your government's seeing you this way. We'll continue to share more about this. The creation of federal zone citizenship was strengthened when you were told to apply for a Social Security number after 1935. The so-called benefits offered by this contract were hurriedly and voluntarily entered into when the Social Security Act was signed into law, because once again, the true facts regarding the outcome of accepting such benefits were withheld due to misrepresentation and a lack of full disclosure. This is why it is important for you not to take any kind of federal subsidy. It's basically putting a rope around your throat, folks. That's what it means. You see, you're trading with you're trading your freedom in for a bowl of soup, so to speak. Further contracts were to be entered into and a license to apply for all voluntary actions. We unknowingly were entering into a lifelong servitude to receive the benefits of the Lord of the Manor, the so-called Military Social Construct Act, for and under the order of the money kings and the Crown of England as the exchequer of the Vatican treasury. We have descended into feudal basilicy. I'll spell that for you, B-A-S-S-A-L-A-G-E. Not seen since before the signing of the Magna Carta, without ever recognizing it. The so-called president, Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then called all the governors into Washington, D.C. for a conference. This was the beginning of the state losing their remaining semblance of their former sovereignty. It was not until 1944 that the corporate states lost all of their power over the corporate United States with the Buck Act. With this act, the state became essentially a 14th Amendment citizens as well. This is why when you pay taxes, it goes through the state at first, but then it's sent to the federal government. They're just a middleman, you see. So people don't recognize what's going on. They don't realize that the federal government is the one who's doing this. They're using a subgroup here as the states to collect those taxes. The Buck Act completed the destruction of the corporate states having any power to protect themselves against usurpation by the military social construct known as the U.S. government. The corporate states now fell under the jurisdiction of Washington, D.C. as mere supervised units under the so-called federal system. Strangely enough, on October 28, 1977, that is, HJR 192 was quietly repealed by Public Law 95147, 91 Statute 1227. The joint resolution entitled Joint Resolution to Assure Uniform Value to the Coins and Currency of the United States, approved, that is, in June 5th, 1933, on the 31 U.S.C. Code 463, shall not apply to obligations issued on or after the date of enactment of this section. The reason for the repeal of HJR 192 is somewhat obscure. After 44 years of unchallenged implementation, the public policy was clearly established by custom, uses, and participation in the so-called credit system by the so-called American public. Those of us who are operating on the privilege of limited liability via the public credit are still bound unless such liability is discharged back to the original source of the debt generated by the issue of money account under the copyright military script known as Federal Reserve notes. So what he's talking about here is this. You need to discharge your debt back to the Treasury Department. So this is the whole idea of a ledger. One side is the debtor side, and one side is the creditor side. And what you're trying to do is that the Federal Reserve System shows you as a debtor. And what you're looking for is to redeem yourself by moving that debt and using that and sending it to the Treasury Department and them giving you credit and pay it in full. That's what you're trying to do. Okay? That's the whole idea here. The adoption of the Uniform Commercial Code, that is the UCC, by all entities allowed them to use the designated copyright name of each and every state in 1964. Along with a number of other like laws and acts were incorporated within the military social construct of the multiple jurisdiction franchise venues in the military social construct known as the United States. This made the UCC, that is the Uniform Commercial Code, the supreme law of the land as pertaining to secure transactions and even documents of title, through the UCC speaks in hidden terms of concerning documents of title. So courts now, the next section is courts shift from common law to equity and admiralty law. Under the social contract known as the Constitution, based on common law, common between those signatories, their posterity, and their agent of trust, profit and honor, and the Republican form of government of the continental United States provides for legal cases, that is, at law, in equity, and in admiralty. Law is the collective organization of the individual right to lawfully defense as it operates over the creators of such social compact. It is the will of the majority which creates such compact. The organization of the natural right of lawful defense. It is the substitution of a common force for individual forces in a reality where such individual power is limited by unity. To do only what the individual forces have a natural and lawful right to do, but in harmony with each member of the whole, to secure the benefits of the one, and at the same time for all signatures thereto, to protect themselves, their posterity, their liberties and properties, to maintain the right of each, and to cause justice to reign over all, willing to declare to each such pledge as necessity to accept and carry out that obligation of such compact. Since people singularly cannot lawfully use force against any people's liberty or property of another people, in most cases due to circumstances unnaturally lacking in contractual foundational societal nexus, so to speak, the common force, for the same reason, cannot lawfully be used to destroy the people, liberty, or property of any people or groups of people. Law allows you to do anything you want to as long as you do not infringe upon the life, liberty, or property of anyone else. Law does not compel performance with a remedy for breach of the international public order, whether locally or otherwise. Today's so-called laws, that is, ordinances, statutes, acts, regulations, orders, and precepts, etc., are often erroneously perceived as law. They're not, folks. But just because something is called a law does not necessarily make it a law. There's a difference between legal and lawful. Anything government does is assumed legal, but it may not be expressed lawfully. Equity is the jurisdiction of a compelled performance for any contract you are a party to, and is based on what is fair in a particular situation. The term equity denotes the spirit and habit of fairness, justice, not justice, but justness, and right dealing with which regulate the intercourse of men with men, connected by agreements and obligations to perform accordingly, as governed among those who are signatories or otherwise by such general acquaintances, acquisitions among them until such time as circumstances may arise to separate the bands which either unite them or otherwise which have led them to accept such circumstances for whatever reason. You have no rights other than what is specifically in your contract, which is governed by the foundational social contract. Equity has no criminal aspect to it. Admirably, is compelled performance plus a criminal penalty. A civil contract with a criminal penalty outside of any social compact, guaranteeing any privileges and or immunities from such application of admiralty jurisdiction. By 1938, the gradual procedural merger between law and equity actions, that is, i.e., the same so-called courts had jurisdiction over legal, equitable, and admirable matters, was recognized and accepted. The military social construct was bankrupt. It now was owned by its creditors, the international bankers, who control everything: the Congress, the executive, the courts, all the states, and the legislators and executives, all the land, all people through misrepresentation and absolute fraud perpetrated from conditioning of mind. This was brought about by those exercising unjust persuasion over all walks of life, not only locally, but upon planetary scale as well. Everything was mortgaged in support to the so-called national debt. They had gone from being sovereigns over government to subjects under government through the use of negotiable instruments to discharge people's debts with limited liability instead of paying people's debts, as common law with gold and silver coin, according to the original mandate of the now non-existent Constitution of the Social Compact, formerly known as the United States of America. And the U itself is not capitalized. It means that simply it's the states are the power, not the federal government. A change in their system of law from public law to private commercial law was recognized by the Supreme Court in the United States in the Erie Railroad versus Tompkins case of 1938. In the same year, the procedure of law were officially blended with the procedures of equity. Prior to 1938, all U.S. Supreme Court decisions were based upon public law. And here's the major change here, or that system of law that was largely controlled by the social compact constitutional limitation. Since 1938, all U.S. Supreme Court decisions are based upon what is termed as public policy. It's no longer public law, it's now public policy. This is a major change in everything, okay? Again, this is a gradualization of everything being taken as we become more and more slaves to this whole system. Public policy concerns commercial transactions made under negotiable instrument law, which is a branch of international law merchant. This has been codified into what is now known as the UCC, or known as Uniform Commercial Code. This system of law was made uniform throughout the 50 franchise substates by the cunning of the military social contract or construct of the United States, all caps, in Congress assembled. Now, I keep saying this, they keep saying the military social contract, okay? Remember, we are under martial law. That's what it means, military social contract. That's martial law. It has never been dealt with since the days of Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so nothing has changed. You see, no one's actually come and says, excuse me, we've got a problem here. Why are we under martial law? In offering grants of negotiable paper, that is the Federal Reserve notes, which the military Congress gave to the 50 substates of the forming union for education. See, they accepted this just like you do. So this is how they fooled them. Well, we'll pay for your education. We'll help build the colleges, your highways, and health, and such. And this is how they drafted the 50 substates into this whole system that they gave up their authority. You see? Congress bound all the former states of the Union into a commercial agreement with the federal military of the United States. As distinguished from the continental United States, the 50 states accepted the benefits offered by the federal military United States as a consideration of a commercial agreement between the federal United States and each of the corporate states. So what they did here is this. With the whole apparatus of the Federal Reserve System, they created again money out of nothing. So that they always could give the states this money in order for education, highways, health care, whatever you name, other purposes. And what that did was put a noose around the state's neck. The states, that was the last semblance of what we call them having any power or refusing it. Now they don't refuse it. I've heard this by the governor of South Carolina a couple of times. We're not going to take your such and such, da da da. And that lasts for about a month or maybe a little longer. And then guess what? They change their tune. They take the money from the federal government. You see, because they want to get elected. You see how all this connects? You see? They become supervised units of the the federal system, and had to assume their portion of the equity debts of the federal United States to the international banking houses for the credit loan. This is unbelievably conniving and destructive for all people. Everybody who wants to be free. You see? The credit which each sub-state received in the form of federal block grants was predicated upon equity paper. The system of negotiable paper binds all corporate entities of government together in a vast system of commercial agreements, has altered their court system from one under the common law to a legislative Article I court or tribunal system of commercial law. Those people brought before this court are held to the letter of every statute of government on the federal, state, county, or municipal level unless they have exercised the remedy provided for them within that system of commercial law whereby, when forced to use a so-called benefit offered or available to them from a so-called government, they may reserve their former right under the common law guarantee of saying, to not be bound by any contract or commercial agreement that they did not enter knowingly, voluntarily, and intentionally. But once this has been done according to international public order, such people are obliged to subject themselves to their former state to their former state if that do not emerge into any other political status freely, determined by people according to the same international public order, constituting it modes of implementing the right of self-determination by these people into such a social compact for their safety, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. In 1976, the military social contract, that is, the United States and Congress assembled, took away any semblance of law or justice left within their court system. All law is now construed and made up by the judges as it happens before your very eyes. Common law has almost disappeared from the courts. They took away any control of authority. They took away any control or authority anyone whosoever might or could have had over the court system. This has been well hidden from all walks of life. Many of the people entering into such courts often wonder why and how the courts can simply override the laws that are paraded for them as sent and used by them in their paperwork to seek remedy to state a just claim of action for government abuse. It's very simple now that we know how they do it. They operate on words that are what we call construed and construct with unrestricted liberty per Senate Bill 94-201 and 94-381. A simple word such as in changed to at, as in at law or in law, has totally separated meanings. For example, if you are in the river, you are wet. You can swim, etc. But if you are at the river, you might enjoy a refreshing picnic, play baseball, or run races. See the difference a simple word can make? The attorneys often change this word when they answer your motions, in addition to many others, to direct the crossing over of their duty at law. An attornment owed to the chamberlains of the exchequer of the treasurer of the Vatican. It will pay you in dividends to read the answers of attorneys to your so-called paperwork, compared to what they say the case law says to the actual case law itself. you'll discover that they have actually changed the words they're in. You might say this would appear to be unlawful. No, not according to the U.S. Code. As you see, they can now construe and construct any law or statute to mean whatever they decide it means for their benefit. You don't know any of it. You don't know any of this. You think they are railroading you in a kangaroo court. No, they are legal in what they do. They usually follow the law to the letter, their law, private law, the law of contract, which you know nothing about. This law is called contract law. A recent example that is counting votes declared irrelevant by the Supreme Court. In 1999, I watched in utter amazement at the Supreme Court of the United States overturn a Florida State Supreme Court decision to proceed with a recount of the contested ballots in the 11th District Court decision to uphold the decision of the Florida court. In Orwellian doublespeak, Chief Justice Antonio Scalia wrote on Saturday, December 9, 1999. Here we go. So the federal government court comes into Florida and says, no, you're out of line here. We're going to change this here, okay? The counting of the votes that are questionably legality does, in my view, threaten irreparable harm to Bush and to the country by casting a cloud upon which he claims to be the legitimacy of his election. Count first and rule upon legality afterwards is not a recipe for producing election results that have the public acceptance, democratic stability required. It was brazen Orwellian decoration. What people who called themselves American, who believed in democracy, could claim that something was wrong with counting votes first. What's so-called American, who believed in democracy, could declare one candidate the winner and protect him from an irreparable harm. In other words, he basically was just biased, okay? If a vote counts, show him not to be the winner after all. Well, of course, it doesn't make any sense unless you realize the foundation upon which Chief Justice Antonio Scalia based his transparency partisans remarks. He doesn't believe in democracy. He doesn't even believe in republicanism. He's a militarist, monarchist attorney, and the chief chairman of the exchequer of the Treasury of Vatican in the U.S. Now, don't get me wrong, because I believe that those who are not willing to exercise their creative given unalienable birthrights to emerge out of slavery to sovereignty are worthy of neither safety nor such liberty, except by those who have united to emerge into a social compact for the exercise of such safety and liberty. Chief Justice Antonio Scalia revealed his true motivations when he spoke on the subject of capital punishment at the University of Chicago, which is where Rockefeller gave money to start this university in February 2002. During his remarks, he stated, the reaction of people of faith to this tendency of democracy to obscure the divine authority behind government should not be resigned to it, but the resolution to combat it as effectively as possible. This is based upon God's justice and ours. This is based upon an article that was at www.firstthings.com. We'll go into that. It just says FT issues. It says 2005 here. So anyway, I want to go into that. But is it possible for democracy to obscure divine authority behind government? Perhaps this helps shed some light on why Chief Justice Antonio Scalia and the four other right-wing justices could so easily subvert any election process and through an act of divine intervention ushered in the son onto the throne lost some 8 years earlier by his father, George I. We're assuming that we are still independent sovereigns and free men as declared by Declaration of Independence, and that the so-called Constitution is still in effect, or that such a document has ever had anything to do with all walks of life. Chief Justice Antonio Scalia has no such illusion. History supports his position, sorry to say. Chief Justice Antonio Scalia is ideological, so accustomed to all walks of life and their willingness to continue to be subjects that he does not even consider the idea of government of, by, and for the people. That idea had remained as a useful fiction to be taught in civics classes and mouthed by politicians to continue to delude the youth of the people, and even when the people grow up and repeatedly show that the facts are absolutely opposite of what has been taught. Chief Justice Antonio Scalia knows that we are mere chattel by presumption, since we have not even discovered that our status as freemen or sovereigns has been lost. You see. Through more than 200 years of assumed history, much less withdrawn and implied consent to be subjects, we are presumed to be subjects before the so-called courts and in the minds of the people, like Chief Justice Antonio Scalia. Due to the control of institutional centers of education, where we become brainwashed in our adolescent years to believe in a system which no longer existed, even if we never had any nexus with that former system which was being taught that our rights were secure by and through such form of system of government. Chief Justice Antonio Scalia speaks of civil disobedience with contempt and quotes the Bible. Ye must needs be subject. We must, as mere servants of the ruling class, acquisition to our divinely guided leaders. Who are we? As mere subjects to question those who make the laws and interpret them. After all, he says that government carries the sword as the minister of God to execute wrath upon the evildoer. Wow, this is unbelievable, folks. Just read what he's saying. No, he has not reverted to a justice of another time. We have, by our ignorance and silence, acquisition to our lower status, reminiscent of another time. There you have it. In his eyes, we are subjects unworthy of honor, peace, and justice. Somehow, Chief Justice Antonio Scalia's statement seems like a long way from the Declaration of Independence, in which so-called Americans stood before the world as sovereigns invested with certain unalienable rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness after the American Revolution. The monarchies of Europe saw the Republican form of democracy as an unnatural, ungodly, ideological threat, just as radical and dangerous as communism was regarded by Western nations upon its inception. Just as the 1917 communist revolution in Russia sprouted other revolutions around the world, the American Revolution provided an example incentive for people all over the world to overthrow their European monarchs, whether wrong or right. What has happened? When did we give up our natural creator-given unalienable birthrights for just any system of government, whether monarchy or otherwise? Our forefathers fought and won that war, didn't they? Not so. Vice Admiralty courts. In English law, courts established in the king's/queen's possession beyond the seas had jurisdiction over maritime causes, including those relating to booty and prize. The United States of America is lawfully the possession of the English Crown, her original commercial joint venture agreement between the colonies and the Crown, and the social compact under the Constitution, which brought all the states, that is only, back under British ownership and rule. The people, however, have sovereign standing in law, independent to any connection to the states or the Crown under the Constitution. This fact necessarily necessitates that the people be brought back one at a time under British rule. The commercial process was the method of choice in order to accomplish this task, first via the 14th Amendment, and second by through the registration of our birth registers and property, and third by the issue of voter registration process, whereby those who registered to vote gave general power of attorney without restriction, reservation, or limitation to act in their stead once in office and without any recourse. All such courses in America are vice admiralty courts in the crowns of private commerce. Read the definitions of courts of exchequer, that is for the Treasury of the Vatican, as defined in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th editions of Black Law's Dictionary. Pay close attention to the term fiction. In English law, a very ancient court of record set up by William the Conqueror as part of the, I'm going to say this, AULA, Regis, REGIS, and afterwards one of the 4 superior courts at Westminster. It was, however, inferior in rank to both the King's Bench and the Common Pleas. It was presided over by a chief baron and 4 sub-barons. It was originally the King's treasurer and was charged with keeping the King's accounts and collecting the royal revenue. But pleas between the subject and subject were anciently heard there, until this was forbidden by the Articular supercariosis. That's Latin, so I'll just say Articula, super, super, and capital Chartas, based in 1290. After which its jurisdiction as a court only extended to revenue cases arising out of the non-payment or withholding of debts to the crown. But the privilege of suing and being sued in this court was extended to the king's accountants, and later by the use of convenient fiction to the effect that the plaintiff was the king's debtor or accountant. The court was thrown open to all suitors in personnel actions. The exchequer had formed both an equity side and a common law side. The New Deal, the United States bankruptcy, the looting of a nation, America's New Deal. The document on the facing page is a reconstruction of HJR 192. It was obtained through the Congressional Research Service by a local congressional representative. The Congressional Research Service is a service of Congressional Law Library and is closed to public asset. Many who read HJR 192 on page 160 fail to comprehend its extraordinary significance. So a bit of introduction is in order. Its 6 paragraphs have done more to change the legal and financial landscape of America than perhaps any 6 paragraphs written prior to it, or since June 5, 1933. It represents no less than the wholesale confiscation of the wealth of the people, the biggest theft in history. See it, Executive Order June 5, 1933. All property and labor into perpetuity was pledged to the international banking cartel. Note that the word manipulators are in top form here. The word bankruptcy is never mentioned. The military Congress spent all of 38 minutes, that is, debating this bill. Must not have been important. No, they'd already made up their minds. Evidently, it would have been far more painful for those who are called Americans to accept the second offer that was being extended by the bankers. Consider the ease of attaining incontrovertible evidence about the bankruptcy. It is shocking to learn that the majority of Americans are completely unaware that bankruptcy ever occurred, how they were drawn into it, or how it became embedded in their lives. Mention this to your friends and they will probably look at you with surprise. Then when you drop the real bomb on them, they think you took a plunge off the deep end. It's all in bold print here. Federal Reserve notes mere promises to pay are equivalent to value to the monopoly money. And you don't have actual title to your homes or vehicles either. You only get to use them if you pay your user fee in the form of license, registration, and property tax. So complete in the comfort of their illusions are those who call themselves Americans that they give new meaning to the phrase, there's a sucker born every second. If you create a system which is fraud from end to end and is both self-reinforcing and transparent, people won't even realize it exists. This is just a master plan from the Satan itself, or the reasons for existence, or what they do to perpetrate existence. This may be because of fear of what is not understood. The only thing one has to fear is fear itself. This fear arises when the very foundation of each and every action perpetrated is founded upon illusionary trickery that, when exposed, creates the need for even more deceit and fraud to maintain a semblance of order. This phenomenon is known as psychological distances. Getting closer to the truth would require the rejection of almost everything that one has been taught to believe is real. Once you realize the speculators being played out daily in the courts and financial markets, institutions of higher learning, entertainment, and the world of politics are little more than clever charades for perpetrating false perceptions, the reason for the people's collective state of confusion comes more sharply into view. Here's a short list of popular beliefs that become fairy tales after the bankruptcy. All people in so-called Americans are citizens of the United States. And the word citizen is in the lowercase. Legal persons are flesh and blood men and women. We can pay our debts in full. Taxes are compulsory. Our elected officials are there to serve us. You hear this from everybody, folks. I hear it. We're a nation based on law. Really? The President of the United States is the most powerful office in America. The Internal Revenue Service is a creature of the federal government. The Federal Reserve is a creature of the federal government. Abuses of power are held in check by three independent branches of government. Attorney's first allegiance is to the client. Attorney needs a license to practice law. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution was about freeing the slaves. America is a constitutional republic. Statutory laws, that is, police, judges, and the courts have jurisdiction over you. All judges and police are required to take oaths of office, swearing to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Congress alone has been delegated the power to coin money and set its value. All of these are myths, will be addressed in different parts of this book. Let's now examine the events that led up to the emergency of 1933. I'm going to take a break right here. In 1929, the military social construct known as the United States entered the Great Depression. At that time, most of the major economic and military powers in the world were also in a depression. You may recall that those who called themselves Americans were permitted to own gold and that their currency was backed by gold and silver. People could deposit their gold in a Federal Reserve Bank. Then the bank would give them a note that they could use to withdraw their gold. Due to the panic in the economic markets after the crash of 1929, people were trying to withdraw their funds from the banks in the currency form of silver and gold. The so-called president, that is Mr. Herbert Hoover, asked the Federal Reserve Board of New York for recommendations on how to deal with the situation. Oh boy, this is a clown. Wow. He recognized that basically they ruled it all already, Herbert Hoover. One might wonder why their president, Mr. Herbert Hoover, would ask the Federal Reserve Board for advice. Good, yeah, very much so. But a review of the Federal Reserve article will show that the Federal Reserve System was in control of the military social construct, known as the United States as its physical agent over the monetary policies of the United States then. We are still under that same power. The Federal Reserve Board adopted a resolution to respond to their president, Mr. Herbert Hoover's request. Here it is. Whereas, in the opinion of the Board of Directors of Federal Bank of New York, the continued and increasing withdrawal of currency and gold from the banks of the country has now created a national emergency. Herbert Hoover's private papers of March 3, 1933. So the Federal Reserve Board is stating that the run on banks is causing a national emergency. Since their currency was backed by gold, why would it cause a national emergency for people to hold the gold rather than the banks? To find the answer, let's see what their president, Mr. Herbert Hoover, had to say. That those spectators and insiders were right was plain enough later on. The first contract of the money changers with the New Deal netted those who removed their money from the country a profit of up to 60% when the dollar was debased. Hoover's policy papers, written by the Secretary of Interior, Secretary Interior, and the Secretary of Agriculture. Their president, Mr. Herbert Hoover, is saying that those with inside knowledge had already removed the money, that is the gold, from the country before the people started demanding their money from the banks. Since the banks didn't have the gold, the people were demanding the banks needed protection. Since the banks didn't have the gold, the people were demanding the banks needed protection. See how they've screwed this thing up? It should have been thrown in jail. So the Federal Reserve Board went on to propose their president, Mr. Herbert Hoover, issue of an executive order based upon the Trading with Enemy Act of 1917. Whereas it is provided in Section 5/B of the Act of October 6, 1917, as amended, that the president may investigate, regulate, or prohibit under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe by means of licensures or otherwise, any transaction in foreign exchange and the export, hoarding, melting of earmarkings of gold or silver coin or bullion or currency. This is from Herbert Hoover's private papers, again from March 3, 1933. Their president, Mr. Herbert Hoover, declined to issue the order. But then Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated as their president on March 4th, 1933. So you see, this is, he knows there's no point in him doing this because he's going to be out of office the next day. But then Mr. Franklin was inaugurated the president March 4th. In his inauguration speech, he requested that Congress grant him emergency powers. The first day he's in office, he's asking for emergency powers. And when someone does that, they are basically going in a coup d'etat in some ways, meaning they're simply no longer going to follow the Constitution or any of that now. They're going to do what they want to do, equal to those who he might have in times of war, to allow him to deal with the crisis. On March 5th, the next day, he issues a proclamation 2038, requesting a special session of Congress beginning on March 9th, 1933. So within 5 days of his office, he's already going to deal with a banking emergency. Then on March 16th, that is another 7 days, the illegitimate president, Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, issues what we call Proclamation 2039, to indicate to the Congress what kind of emergency powers he was asking for. This proclamation has exactly the same wording as that proposed by the Federal Reserve Board. But the proclamation had no authority until Congress met to give him the required authority. One might well ask how the Federal Reserve Board could have such influence over their acting president. Some researchers speculate that the Depression was engineered by the Federal Reserve System and the international bankers that it represents. See the essay called The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, which is the book I have right to my left here, for information about the link between the Federal Reserve System and the international bankers. This is the one that Eustace Mullins wrote. The bankers' motive was to further consolidate their power. You remember the story, It's a Wonderful Life? You remember James Stewart and Potter? You remember when there's a bank run taking place with the bank? So people come to Jimmy Stewart's office. That is his, not realty, but I know what it is. But anyway, we'll continue. And they want their money. And he tells them, so the money's over here at Joe's house. It's over here at Robert's place. Property over here is at Bob's house, such and such. It goes on. There's no money here. It's all based on the assets are in people's homes and property. That's what he's trying to tell them. And what takes place simply is he says, we're all panicking here. And so Potter is taking advantage of that because he's bought out the department store. He's just taken over the bank because we're panicking what's going on. And he's getting a great deal. In other words, he's paying 10 cents on the dollar for something because everybody's scared and fear. And that's what Mr. Potter did. He seized the bank and the department stores, as you remember. You can learn a lot about what that little bit of piece in that movie is about, because that's what took place under Roosevelt and also under others, especially even Wilson, after he gave the okay, so they had money to start a war. So they already controlled the monetary policy of the United States. That's all caps. There's also speculation that the military social construct known as the U.S. government was told that it had no choice in cooperating with the Federal Reserve Board, that is the international bankers, or the Depression would remain indefinite. What's interesting, in 1933, this is done. It did remain indefinite for a long time, folks. Many people lost everything. Under such political blackmail, their president, Congress, and courts were willing to acquiesce to the demands of the money king bankers. Bear these speculations in mind as you read who quickly gave the Federal Reserve System what it wanted. These speculations will be an area for further research. The very first act passed by Congress when they met in special sessions has the following preamble. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled that the Congress hereby declares that a serious emergency exists and that it is imperative necessary to speedily Anytime they're in a hurry to do something, folks, it's a red flag. Put into effect remedies of uniform national application. On the first day of their special session, Congress approves Proclamation 2039. On the second day, on the same day, the President, Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, reissues it as Proclamation 2040. Whereas under the Act of March 9, 1933, now this is 5 days after he's come into office here, folks. All proclamations herefore or hereafter issued by the President pursuant to the authority enforced by Section 5 in brackets B of the Act of October 6, 1917, as amended, are approved and confirmed. President Roosevelt's Proclamation 2040. On the same day, Congress passed the following statute. They're in a hurry to get the stuff done, folks. They're not even looking at the bills, so to speak. During time of war or during any other period of national emergency declared by the President may, through any agency that he may designate or otherwise investigate, regulate, or prohibit under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe by means of licensure or otherwise, any transaction in foreign exchange, transactions of credit between or payments by banking institutions as defined by the President, and export, hoarding, melting, or any earmarkings of gold or silver coin or bullion or currency by any person within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Title I, Section 2, 48 Statute 1, March 9, 1933, emphasis added. This is actually the same language that was found in the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act. The exclusion of transactions within the United States had been removed from the statute. It's a capital U, capital United States. This statute can now be found in the United States Code at 12 U.S.C. 95B. This is the current version of the statute. Notice that the wording is almost identical to that found in 1933 statute, shown in the above paragraph. Section 95B. Ratification of acts of President and Secretary of Treasury under Section 95A. The actions, regulations, rules, license, orders, and proclamations heretofore or hereafter taken, promulgated, made, or issued by the President of the United States or the Secretary of Treasury, such March 4, 1933, pursuant to the authority conferred by Section 95A of this title, are approved and confirmed. This is based upon U.S. Code 95B, Section 95B. This version says that the authority is granted in 12 U.S.C. Section 95A. But if you look at the notes of that statute, you will see that the original source authority is located in October 6, 1917, Chapter 106, Section 5B, 40th Statute 415. And later on, in March 9, 1933, Chapter 1, Title 1, Section 2, 48 Statute 1. So the alleged president still has the authority as it was originally granted in 1917 and later modified in 1933. The effect of this emergency power is that all who call themselves Americans are now part of the Trading with the Enemy Act, as amended in 1933. The significance of this change will soon become apparent. Since the bankers didn't have gold to pay out, the alleged president, Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, using Proclamation 2039 and 2040, along with the provision of 12 U.S.C. Statute 95B, to create a banking holiday. This can be verified if we read the definition for banking holiday of 1933. That's what we're going to do. Banking holiday of 1933, Presidential Proclamation number 2039, issued March 6, 1939, and number 2040, issued on March 9, 1933, temporarily suspending banking transactions by member banks of the Federal Reserve System. Normal banking functions were resumed on March 13, subject to certain restrictions. The first proclamation it was held had no authority in law until the passage of March 9, 1933 of a ratified act, that is in parentheses 12 U.S.C. CA Section 95B. The present law forbids member banks of the Federal Reserve System to transact banking business, except under regulation of the Secretary of the Treasurer during an emergency proclaimed by the President, 12 U.S.C.A. Section 95. It's in Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition, emphasis added. The restriction mentioned in the above definitions are that the bankers had to be licensees before they could be reopened. Get it? A license is something that grants authority to do something that would otherwise be illegal. Trading or conducting business with the enemy, the so-called Americans on assumed American soil, was made illegal activities unless it was licensed. Their president, Mr. FDR, papers revealed that the government would grant the license. The Secretary of Treasury will issue licenses to banks which are members of the Federal Reserve System, whether national bank or state, located in each of the 12 Federal Reserve Bank cities, to open Monday morning. President Roosevelt's papers. Another provision passed on March 9, 1933, given Federal Reserve agents the authority to act as agents of the U.S. Department of Treasury. Do you hear that? Another provision passed on March 9th, giving Federal Reserve agents the authority to act as agents of the U.S. Department of Treasury. This seems strange since the Federal Reserve System is a private business. And it is. It's not a government agency at all. When required to do so by the Secretary of Treasury, each Federal Reserve agent shall act as an agent of the Treasury of the United States or of the Comptroller of the currency, or both, for the performance of any function which the Treasurer or the Comptroller may be called upon to perform in carrying out the provisions of this paragraph. 48 Statute 1 emphasized added. We already seen that the insiders had removed most of the gold from the banks and its warehouses before the people started demanding their money from the bankers. The bankers didn't have the money, you see. The people were demanding. So the bankers sought protection. In order to do this, the people had to be declared the enemy. The Trading with the Enemy Act, as revised in 1933, accomplished that. Then Congress passed a statute that authorized stiff fines or prison sentences if people didn't turn in their gold. This would be considered high treason if it wasn't a hoot that such power used was founded solely upon the law of necessity and not a true representation of such authority by fully aware and informed people. Whenever in the judgment of Secretary of Treasury such action is necessary to protect the currency system of the United States, the Secretary of Treasury is in his discretion may regulate any of all the individual partnerships, associations, and corporations to pay and deliver to the Treasury of the United States any or all gold coins, gold bullion, gold certificates owned by such individual partnerships, associations, and corporations. Whoever shall not comply with the provision of this act shall be fined not more than $10,000. Those $10,000 is a lot of money back then. The gold itself at that time was only worth $25 an ounce. Or if a natural person, in addition to such fine, may be in prison for a year, not exceeding 10 years. So basically it would be a limitation from 1 year to almost to 10 years. Statute 48, Section 1, Title 1, subsection N, March 9, 1933, emphasis added. So not only were people not able to get their gold, but their gold was confiscated by the military social construct of government. Since all money was gold and silver certificates, and all of this money had to be turned in, the people were left without any money of exchange in law. This is robbery, pure and simple robbery. These people are devils. During this banking holiday, it was at first believed that some form of scrip or emergency currency would be necessary for the conduct of ordinary business. We knew that it would be essential when the banks reopened to have an adequate supply of currency to meet all possible demands of depositors. Consideration was given by government officials and various local agencies and the advisability of issuing clearinghouse certificates of some similar form of local emergency currency. On March 7, 1933, the Secretary of Treasury issued a regulation authorizing clearinghouses to issue demand certificates against sound assets of the banking institutions. But this authority was not to become effective until March 10. In many cities, the printing of these certificates was actually begun, but after the passage of the Emergency Banking Act on March 9, 1933, the 48th statute, number 1, it became evident that they would not be needed because the act made possible the issue of the necessary amount of emergency currency in the form of Federal Reserve banknotes, which could be based on any sound asset owned by the bank. Roosevelt's papers. So we see that their president, Mr. Franklin D. FDR, papers admit that the Emergency Banking Act made it possible to issue emergency currency that was based upon the assets of the bank rather than upon the gold or silver. Remove the U.S. from the gold standard. The emergency currency was Federal Reserve banknotes. Federal Reserve notes are still used today. Next, we will see what was to be used to back up the Federal Reserve banknotes. So upon the deposit with the Treasury of the United States, A, of any direct obligations of the United States, or B, of any notes, drafts, bills of exchange, or banking acceptance acquired under the provision of this act, any Federal Reserve bank making such deposit in the manner prescribed by the Secretary of Treasury shall be entitled to receive from the controller of the currency circulating notes in blank, duly registered and countersigned. The Emergency Banking Act of March 9, 1933, Section 4, Public Law 89-719. Later in 1933, the House of Representatives passed a joint resolution to suspend the gold standard and abrogate the gold clause, which says in part that every provision contained in or made with respect to any obligation which purports to give the obligee a right to require payment in gold, a particular kind of coin or currency, or any amount of money of the United States measured thereby is declared to be against public policy. They stole the gold, folks. They stole it all. And no such provision shall be contained in or made respect to any obligation hereafter incurred. So these damn fuckers, these stupid shit butt politicians did this shit. And you should be mad, even though it's been almost 100 years ago, folks. They stole that money from legitimate people. These are your grandparents, folks. House Joint Resolution 192, June 5th, 1933. Emphasis added. Since this measure was passed as a joint resolution, it does not have the force of law. You will notice that the resolution used the term public policy. We frequently hear the term public policy used, but what does it mean? Policy. The general principles by which a government is guided in its management of public affairs, based upon Black's Law Dictionary, 7th edition. Public policy, broadly principles and standards regarded by the legislature or by the courts as being a fundamental concern to the state and the whole of society. Black's Law Dictionary, 7th edition. Public policy is not the same thing as public law. Public law means the body of law dealing with the relationship between private individuals and the government, and with the structure and operation of the government itself, a statute affecting the general public. Black's Law Dictionary, 7th edition. This is really a startling admission on the part of Congress. They're saying that what they are doing by refusing to pay the federal debt in gold is not according to the law, but rather a public policy. So we see that currency was no longer backed by gold. even if it's only a public policy. The new currency was Federal Reserve bank notes. These notes were and still are backed by direct obligation of the United States, which are Treasury notes. They are also backed by bank notes, drafts, bill of exchange, and bank acceptance. This last group is loans that Federal Reserve member banks were holding on loans they had made to people and institutions. So the public or private debt instruments of the bank were considered assets to be deposited in the Treasury in exchange for circulating notes. Excerpts can further prove this from the congressional record during the debate over the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. Mr. McFadden, the first section of the bill, as I grasped it, is practically the war powers that was given back in 1917. I would like to ask the chairman of the committee if this is a plan to change the holdings of the security back of the Federal Reserve notes to the Treasury of the United States rather than the Federal Reserve agent. Mr. Stegall, this provision is for the issuance of Federal Reserve bank notes and not for Federal Reserve notes. And the security back of it is the obligation, notes, drafts, bill of exchange, bank acceptance outlined in the section to which the gentleman has referred. McFadden, then the used circulation is to be Federal Reserve bank notes and not Federal Reserve notes. Is that true? And so far as the provisions of this section are concerned, yes. Mr. Britton, from my opposition of the bill as it was read to the House, it would appear that the amount of bank notes that might be issued by the Federal Reserve System is not limited. That would depend entirely upon the amount of collateral that is presented from time to time from exchange for bank notes. Is that not correct? McFadden, yes, I think that is correct. It should be clear that the currency was no longer backed by gold, but by a promise to pay on various debt instruments, that is, loans to private individuals or public businesses and the government. So there were no hard assets backing up the currency, only promises, folks. In the case of government loans, the collateral would be the full faith and credit of the United States. This is very strong evidence that the federal government was actually bankrupt at that time. If it weren't, the federal government would still be willing to pay its obligations in gold and the currency would still be backed by gold. Well, the problem, the reason why the federal government can't pay it is simply because the Federal Reserve has it. And the Federal Reserve is not a federal office. It's a group of independent bankers. Who did the federal government owe money to? The obvious answer is the Federal Reserve banks, who are holding the direct obligations of the United States. The Federal Reserve is a private bank. It is not part of the government. The logical conclusion is that the government is bankrupt and the Federal Reserve is the creditor. The transition from a gold-backed currency to one that was not backed by any hard asset was very swift. The Federal Reserve Board proposed it to their president, Mr. Herbert Hoover, but it took until a more acceptable agent resided within their spectrum of the military social construct on March 3rd, 1933. Yes, that's correct. They presented this to Herbert Hoover. He said, I don't want anything to do with it. He knew, even though Mr. Hoover is not a clean guy neither, because he went on board with all the stuff that took place during the bankruptcy, the panic, or what I would call the Great Depression, 1929. So he was the president during that time, and he did very little to help people. If you watch a documentary on the bonus army, this represents Mr. Hoover in office. That bonus army wanted its bonuses because they fought in World War I. They were promised this and they were never given it. So they marched on to Washington to get that. And Mr. Hoover's way of dealing with that was simply bringing in the military and to force those people out. And they kill people, their own citizens. Mr. Hoover told them not to do certain things, but yet MacArthur went ahead and did what he wanted to. He burned the area, what we call shanty part of where these people were staying. And they were being shot at by soldiers. So you think you're free, yet soldiers were firing on their own people in the Hoover's presidency. So Mr. Herbert Hoover apparently got tired of the dirty work and said, no, I don't want to do anything with it. Give it to somebody else. I'm not messing with it. How can we account for such a rapid change in circumstances? We have not uncovered, at least thus far, direct evidence of undue influence by the Federal Reserve, that is, international bankers. However, their position as creditor to the United States does provide a possible or plausible explanation as to why things change so rapidly. The final topic to explore is the impact of the so-called American citizens. And we will conclude tonight this particular deal. We'll be dealing with another subject, what we call impact of bankruptcy. But I appreciate you listening, and hope that you enjoyed it. I appreciate your attention, and I hope that in the near future that you will learn quite a bit, because what I'm doing is radical and is to educate you. And I'm doing my time to actually try to help people to see the truth. So I wish you good night. You take care. Thank you for listening.